Hey there, it's Silver. This is Deathbound. So this is a new Soulslike, something that we're seeing an increasing number of, but I'm still always interested in looking at because, well, I like the genre a lot, I'll admit, but also I think there's still a lot of room for new ideas, different directions to take the genre, and I think this game actually does manage to do that in several ways. The world itself is a little bit unusual. It's kind of urban fantasy-esque. I mean, when you first see it, it looks like it's going to be a sort of medieval fantasy setting because you've got this dude in armor talking about basically being a crusader for this goddess of death, and it looks very much like medieval stasis-y. But then the city they invade has like electricity and subways and neon signs everywhere and stuff. So it's a bit of an interesting mix of like more traditional fantasy tropes, but with a more urban fantasy setting. And the basic backstory here I think is actually kind of interesting, but a little bit hard to follow because it's given to you very piecemeal. But what seems to have happened is there was a sort of ancient order of humans that were immortal. Something happened that caused them to give up their immortality, and now there are two major factions based on two goddesses, one of life and one of death. And the goddess of death has followers that are extremely militant and very much like Catholic guilt themed. And then the life cultists are more about trying to experiment with life. There are some necromancers involved, although they're called essence-mancers. And also there's a sense of trying to figure out how they were immortal in the past and get back to that. And the biggest interesting thing here, the biggest departure from the formula, is that you don't play one character. You actually play four characters at once. And I have never seen this in a Souls-like before. I guess some people may point to games like Mortal Shell, but that was a very different setup than this. Mechanically, it's not really similar at all. And also, I'm pretty sure this game was in development before that, so the idea kind of predates that. But yeah, in this case, you have four characters at once. You don't just play one that you can switch between. You actually have all four of them with you at any given time, and you can swap between them on the fly with the D-pad. And when I say on the fly, I really do mean it, because there's this morph mechanic that means you can spend some of that sync gauge at the bottom of the screen that you build up from dealing damage and morph instantly. Normally, if you switch from character to character, there's a short sort of animation that roots you in place for just a second as you switch between them. But if you use one of these segments of this gauge, you can morph during some other animation, and it happens basically instantly and has some extra benefits. For instance, you can do it while you're dodging so that you'll start the dodge as one character but end it as a new character. And there's even a morph attack where you can morph right after an attack lands in order to do a follow-up really strong attack for the cost of one segment of that gauge to a new character. And you can even save up the entire gauge and do a super morph attack that is really, really strong and has really generous immunity frames. And it actually only takes 4 out of the 5 segments to use it, but you have to have all 5 present to use it. Each of the characters you can play as has their own set of stats, as well as 4 different actions on each of the shoulder buttons. So you've usually got like, a basic attack of some kind, and then you've got like some sort of heavy attack or other type of ability, and then often some sort of maybe a block or a buff and some other stuff like that. Usually some sort of status effect causing attack. It depends on the characters. There are several characters you can actually choose from. Even though you have 4 with you at any given time, there are actually more than 4 in the game. There are actually 7 characters total that you'll get, although the last couple you'll only get pretty late into the game, honestly. So this means, unusually for a Souls-like, it's not about creating your own build, but rather about sort of combining 4 already present builds, since these characters already have equipment and things they can do. You aren't finding weapons or armor or anything in this game because each character comes equipped with whatever they will have at all times. And instead, you are getting this essence, which is basically your souls, to spend on a skill tree that actually improves everyone at once. There's a pretty good-sized skill tree, and every level is 1 node on the tree, so every time you select a node, you will level up. That's how it works. And also, there are 7 segments of the skill tree that are related to each of the characters, and they have these more valuable large nodes that still only take 1 point to purchase, but they give you a whole bunch of things at once, basically, and you can purchase each of them 3 times as well. So these are like your more significant character-related buffs, effectively. And like I said, all of these nodes affect all characters. So if you buy a whole bunch of extra maximum health and melee damage, then that means all of your characters will benefit from it at the same time. There are also memory points that you can find. As you're exploring around, you'll find these semi-invisible vibrating things in the world, and if you switch to the correct character, they'll start to glow, and you can interact with them. And they will either be a key item of some kind that's related to that character's past, or an event that happened in that area in that character's past. Either way, you'll get some lore for that character, some backstory for them, a scene that shows something that happened to them before the game started and when they were still alive, and you'll also get a memory point, and that's because every character has a list of a bunch of different sort of perks that they can purchase for 1 point each. And these also generally affect everyone, but some of them are a little bit more specific. Like, for instance, the assassin lady gets one that causes her basic blade attacks to build up poison damage, or the spear lady gets one that causes her spear thrust attacks to build up the bleeding status effect. But there are others that are more general as well and not necessarily tied to a specific person. So these are all really powerful, and creating a combination of these is the sort of this game's version of making a build. But there's also one other interesting mechanic that helps to round all this out, and that's those orange and blue lines you'll see on the left side of the screen around the character portraits. This is the synergy or conflict system. Basically, every character has their own beliefs. There are set characters, so they'll have their own beliefs and pasts and the factions that they were adhered to when they were alive and things like that. And this means that some of them think alike to each other, and some of them are kind of at each other's throats. They all get to talk. They all can speak at once, which is kind of cool. And these synergies or conflicts adds a little bit of extra depth to building a party. You want characters next to each other that have good effects together, because it actually is determined by who that character's slot is physically next to, which ones they're related to. So if you have a synergy, then that means both characters involved get a good buff. If you've got a conflict, this means that both characters involved get a pretty significant but not crippling debuff, and then a really good buff at the same time. So one is purely positive, one is power at a price, positive and negative at the same time. Also, one thing you might be noticing is that there doesn't seem to be a basic health or stamina gauge anywhere on the screen, and that's because the character portraits over there are actually both of those at once. And this is a weird mechanic that I'm not sure I like, but it is here, and that is that the health gauge is that diamond shape that makes up the character's symbol. And as you take damage, it empties, and eventually if they die, then that's it. You can only lose one character, you don't get to switch. So if any one character dies, it's back to a checkpoint. But the green overlay on top of the red health gauge is your stamina, which means your stamina is limited by your maximum health. As your maximum health gets decreased, the size of your stamina gauge decreases in equal proportion. So the more damaged you are, the less stamina you have to work with. The healing mechanic is also a little bit unusual. At first, it looks like a traditional Estus-like healing system, but it's not quite. You have this injector, so it's faster, kind of like a Bloodborne blood vial, but it's not a consumable that you can farm. It is charge-based. You have 4 charges of it, and every time you go back to a checkpoint, it refreshes, and one use is 1 charge. However, the catch is, when you use it, it heals the character you're currently playing by 90 HP, but it hurts the other 3 for 30 each, so it actually damages your other characters while healing the one you've currently selected. As far as I can tell, this can't kill a character. If they're at like critically low HP, it'll reduce them to 1, but I don't think it'll actually kill them, so that's something. Also, I have to admit the consumable system in general is a little bit clunky, and that's mostly just because of the way the controls work. Because the D-pad is set to changing your characters around, this means you can't use it for, pressing left and right and up and down and stuff to select different consumables. Instead, you have to hold the use button, the consumable use button, which is X, and then press the L1 and R1 buttons, your sort of light attack buttons, in order to switch between the slots. It works as a mechanic, it just, the control is a little bit finicky at times. In like a pitched boss battle, doing this is kind of difficult. Another kind of interesting idea is there is equipment in this game. You don't get weapons or armor for the characters, but you do get artifacts and rings, and these affect everyone. You don't equip them individually, you equip them in one equipment screen, and then everyone benefits from them. You've got 1 artifact slot and 2 ring slots, and these can have all sorts of different effects, but the cool idea here is they each have 2 different effects, and you get both of them at once, but you can find these upgrades, either mystic or ancient, green or blue, and you can then spend some of your essence and these upgrades to improve that aspect of the ring or the artifact. So if you've got a ring and you really like its mystic effect, you might spend some of those mystic upgrades to improve that part of it and leave its ancient effect alone because you don't need it as much much or something like that. But the trick is you only have 5 upgrade slots per item, so you have to choose, you sort of pick and choose which slots you want which upgrades in, since you only get 5 times to improve them. So overall, we've got a game that has some pretty unique ideas, and they don't exactly feel like gimmicks because they are integrated into the mechanics so well. Like the whole 4-person party thing could easily be a gimmick, but because all of the other mechanics sort of focus around it, and even the way the combo system works and stuff that makes use of all these 4 characters, it means that it actually works relatively well, and that it creates a game whose mechanics are at least pretty interesting. However, there's a big problem here. You see, all this other stuff, all these other mechanics are fun and neat ideas, but they are secondary. They are peripheral to the primary gameplay loop of a Souls-like, which is the combat. You need the combat and the exploration to be good. And the exploration in this game, in my opinion, is actually pretty solid, with a good amount of, going back through previous areas to find shortcuts and stuff. They're connected pretty well. They are visually interesting because of this whole neat urban fantasy setting. It's pretty good in terms of its exploration. However, its combat is not great. And to explain, do you remember the Shrine of Amana in Dark Souls 2? And I'm sorry for making you remember that, but that area is widely considered to be one of the worst areas in the entire trilogy because it's incredibly obnoxious to go through. And one of the more obvious things that people dislike about it is all the projectile spam, but really that's not the biggest issue with that area. It's annoying, but it's manageable. The biggest issue were those Drake Knight dudes that had like infinite stamina and could just attack and attack and attack over and over and never stop. Well, imagine a game where every enemy are those guys and you've got my problem with Deathbound's combat. Every single enemy in this game seems to have infinite stamina and just endlessly spams combos over and over again and never stops. Even the most basic and easy to stagger enemies do not get staggered very well. This game has a stagger system, but it's almost useless, because you'll notice the lock-on reticle sort of fills up as you deal damage to enemies, and when it gets full, they get staggered. However, it takes a long time to build this gauge up, and if you stop attacking them for a couple of seconds, it all empties at once. And since these enemies have infinite stamina and never stop attacking you, they can just throw you across the arena at any point and reset their own stagger gauges, which means you'll very rarely get to actually fill them, because the enemies never ever stop and are extremely aggressive and make a beeline for you at any given time. Most of the times I died in this game was because I got slammed into a corner by like 6 dudes, and there was nothing I could do. I couldn't move or do anything. They were all just mega aggressive and never stopped attacking, and that's just how you die most of the time. Even the enemies that you would expect to get staggered easily as a way to deal with them don't. Like, you might see an unarmored crossbow-wielding dude in the early game and think, oh, I need to walk up to that guy and smack him in the head before he shoots me to stop him from using his range attack. Except they can just tank your attacks and not get staggered, even the most basic of enemies, and they will shoot you point blank in the face and never get staggered, and this just goes up from there. Every single enemy in this game is just a spammy ball of blades and teeth that never stops attacking, especially the bosses. Like, for instance, this guy. What am I even supposed to do here? This boss never stops moving. It is constantly attacking. There is no point at which it's safe to get in melee range and actually hit it, which means you just have to trade damage and hope that it dies before you. And when I finally beat this boss, I didn't feel like I was skilled. I didn't feel like it clicked and it worked for me and I figured out what to do. I felt like I just got lucky. And that's overall my problem with this game's combat. Everything is like this. Every single thing in the game is just a constant spam of attacks, and there's not much you can do about it since you can't really stagger anything, and also you cannot attack or dodge very much. You have very low stamina in this game. You can dodge 2, maybe 3 times, even if you've upgraded your stamina several times, which means you could get 3 perfect dodges at the beginning of a battle, and then not take any damage and feel really good about yourself, except that enemy has about 47 more attacks they're about to send at you, so the fact that you dodged those 3 doesn't matter at all because they're about to kill you anyway. And that's only if there's 1 enemy in the room, and frequently there's like 5 or 6 that all do this. The farther I got into the game and the more enemy variety was revealed, the more it became apparent that the entirety of this game's difficulty just relies on insanely mega aggressive enemies with endless combos and no stagger thresholds. This means you can basically forget fighting any bosses that spawn adds. If a boss is already this spammy and never stops attacking, and they spawn like 2 or 3 or more enemies in the arena, then I don't even know what you're supposed to do at that stage. So there's no real way around it. It just feels like a complete mess. And there are ways to build your team to sort of help deal with this a little bit, but none of it feels sufficient. Like, in my opinion, the most interesting character in the game is unfortunately the last one you get. She's an elementalist that has a sort of lightning, chain lightning style of attack, as well as like a freezing beam and a flamethrower and a sort of flame enchantment for everyone else's weapons. She's really fun to use, but she's extremely fragile and her attacks are kind of slow and take a lot of stamina, which is the case with all of your characters, really. And by the way, attacking with anyone roots you in place for a very long time, and you can't really dodge out of attacks. You can't cancel stuff very easily in this game. So you're sort of rooted in place and committed to an attack for a very long time every time you hit the attack button, which is not good with enemies this aggressive. But the fact that you have characters with these interesting kits and the ability to build a fun team, it seems like it might help you a little bit, and it's fun to build a good team, but at the same time, since all the enemies are so spammy, it kind of feels like all of your building is for nothing because you won't be able to use any sort of tactics or anything like that, because all of the potentially interesting things you could do as a team kind of go out the window when every single room turns into a giant blender. And complicating matters even further is the fact that this game is a little bit of a technical mess, unfortunately. I've had it crash on me many times. The farther I got into the game, the more often it crashed, and I eventually had to give up playing because it was crashing so often I was losing progress and I wasn't able to continue. There was also one instance where it didn't crash, but it sort of took away my ability to interact with the game. It was weird. I could still move around, my movement controls worked, but nothing else worked. No attacks, no menus, nothing. The escape key didn't work, even Alt F4 didn't work. I could only move. I had to actually pull up the task manager and force close the game and restart it. So the game is definitely a bit of a technical mess, and there's also the fact that it hitches a lot too. There's some weird performance issues in certain areas, and again, the farther you get into the game, the more apparent these become, and the hitching starts to really mess with your button inputs and stuff, to the point that I feel like the game drops your attack button input constantly, and you press the attack button 2 or 3 times and nothing happens because it just decided it didn't feel like it. So overall, what we've got here is a game with some really interesting ideas and some pretty good execution on a lot of those ideas, but they're all surrounding a combat system at its core that is just fundamentally flawed and unfun to interact with because everything is so spammy and obnoxious that it just becomes a slog to do anything. So when you combine that just fundamental combat design issue with the fact that it's technically kind of messy and likes to crash a lot, I can't really recommend Deathbound at its current price, which is unfortunate because I do like what it's doing and I do think it has some fun ideas and is made by people with a good ability to make those ideas a reality. I just think that the combat at the center of everything is just not really up to par in its current state. So maybe this is one of those games that you should keep an eye on for updates and sales, because it's still worth looking at in terms of some of the neat things that it does, but not at full price. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for Deathbound if you wish to check it out yourselves. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.